We finished 1 Corinthians a couple of weeks ago, and we're just now into 2 Corinthians. So we're 2 Corinthians chapter number 1. 2 Corinthians chapter number 1. And this evening we'll be looking at verses 8 through 11. 2 Corinthians chapter number 1. And we'll be looking at verses 8 through 11. I'd like to read through verse number 10, and then we'll have some comments, and I'm going to end up with verse number 11, and it'll make sense once we're into the message. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 8, Paul says, "For we would not, brethren, have you to be ignorant." Now, I'm glad for commas. You know, a lot of times he says, I'm glad, I would not have you ignorant, brethren. Where do you put the comma there? I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, and I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren. He doesn't want either one of those. And so punctuation is vital sometimes. It says, again, "For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble, which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God which raiseth the dead, who delivered us from so great a death, and doth deliver, in whom we trust, that he will yet deliver us." And so something happened to Paul. Something has happened to Paul where he despaired even of life. But in that time, he recognized that God was his deliverer. And so that's what we're reading in these verses. So something has happened. Now, a lot of times people will go to Acts chapter 19, and that's where we're going to go. But I believe that this is just a small portion of what was going on in Paul's life. So if you would, hold your place here. Let's go over to Acts chapter 19 and see what was going on in Asia, and more specifically in Ephesus, that caused Paul to despair. So in Acts chapter 19, and we'll pick up in verse 23. Acts chapter 9, and I don't really want to preach a whole lot on this because we're in Acts in the morning, and I'm eventually going to get to this and I'm going to preach through it. So if I seem light on the subject in Acts, that's going to be the reason why. I'm coming up to it on Sunday mornings. But there was a circumstance or a series of events that happened, and I believe it started with Demetrius. In Acts chapter 19, starting in verse 23, it says this, "In the same time there arose no small stir about that way." Now, if you mark your Bibles, you ought to mark the words "that way." That's how they used to refer to Christianity back in the New Testament times. So if you read phrases and it says "that way," and it's not speaking of a direction, it's just that New Testament or early church name, if you will, of Christianity. Okay, so there arose no small stir about that way. Now, who always stirs the pot? Paul always stirs the pot, doesn't he? You know, we've seen that on Sunday mornings in Acts. Paul goes into a city, he goes to the synagogue, they kick him out of the synagogue, there's no small stir. There's a big uprising. Although he sees many people saved, there's always a big uprising. And so that's what's happening here. "For a certain man," in verse 24, "named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen." So when we just read that, what is the purpose of the no small stir? It's money. It just comes right down to money. And he says right there, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen. So Demetrius, a silversmith, and he made these shrines, but he also hired other people, didn't he? He probably had the Walmart of shrines. He probably had 20 people working for him. They would say, hey, we're going to go down to Diana Mart. And I'm going to pick me out a statue for my living room. Oh, well, I'm getting a little tarnished on mine, so I think I'm going to go upgrade mine. By the way, I got a little one because I couldn't hardly afford one, so I'm going to go down and I'm going to get a bigger one. That was Demetrius' job. And he would have craftsmen under him. And so he was not only getting money for himself, but he was bringing money in for craftsmen. Then, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation and said, sirs, you know that by this craft we have our wealth. Moreover, you see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods, which are made with hands. So that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshipeth. Now, is that the truth? Verse 28, and when they had heard these sayings, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, great is Diana of the Ephesians. And the whole city was filled with confusion. And having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. And when Paul would have entered in unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. And certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused. And the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander beckoned with the hand, and would have made his defense unto the people. But when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice about the space of 2 hours, cried out, great is Diana of the Ephesians. When the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not that the city of the Ephesians is a worshiper of the great goddess Diana and of the image which fell down from Jupiter? Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, ye ought to be quiet and to do nothing rashly. For ye have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which are with him have a matter against any man, the law is open. And there are deputies, let them implead one another. But if you inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. For we are in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. So this man comes on the scene and kind of diffuses the whole situation. But for 2 hours, for 2+ hours, the city of Ephesus is in an uproar because Paul showed up. Paul hadn't even spoken yet. Did you guys notice that Paul hadn't even come into the theater yet? And you might be asking yourselves, why in 2 Corinthians are we talking about Paul talking, about the sentence of death and where they were pressed out of measure and their strength was taken and all. When we read this account, and Paul didn't even, as far as we could tell, get involved. I believe this is only one of the things that was going on at the time. Now, what do you think? Do you think Demetrius and those craftsmen just said, oh, okay, well, the townsperson, he spoke, and so I'm good with that? What do you think? Let me tell you from experience. Most of you know my wife and I were missionaries in Mexico before we came here and started this church. Is there any similarity between the statue Diana and the statues that are worshipped down in Mexico? Is there any difference between the kind of church that they had and the kind of church that they had? If you look back through history, they're really similar. And I was dumb. When I was younger, I was dumb. Excuse me. When we went into Mexico, of course, the first year we spent learning the language. I could preach a whole message on that. When you go into a foreign land, you ought to learn the language of the land. By the way, you ought to go there legally too. We got papers every 6 months. We had to renew our papers every 6 months. And I learned their language so I could speak to them in their language. It would be kind of dumb for me to go down there and try to teach them English so I could preach to them the scriptures. So I went down there. We spent the first year learning their language. When we got done with language school, our instructor, being as encouraging as she was, said, "You guys now speak like natives." Kindergartners, but natives. That's what she told us. And then we moved up to our city, Zacatecas, and we lived in Zacatecas for the next, it must have been 8, almost 9 years. And we started 2 churches there. The first church that we started, I rented one whole level in a high-rise building. Now, the high-rise was only like 6 or 8 stories tall. And I had the first, not street level, but the first level above the street, because the street was storefront. We walked up some steps, and then you walked in our door, and that was our first full level was our church. It was in the shadow of 7 Catholic cathedrals. One of them was a basilica. Now, if you know anything about the Catholic Church, a basilica is one of the churches that the Pope is visiting. So sometime in the history, the Pope visited this one. I was in the shadow of 7. That's how dumb I was. And I hung banners. Big banners. I wanted people driving by on the street to be able to read my banners. And I had two. It was a 2-parter, so I could change out the second part. The first one is, "Do you know?" I wrote that in Spanish. Or, "Do you want to know?" And then I would change out what's coming in the future, who God really is, and it was different things like that, and I could swap it out. My banners kept disappearing. They would shimmy up a telephone pole and get out on the balconies where I was hanging my banners, and they would take my banners. Because Zacatecas was a city that was wholly given over to the Virgin Mary. And so we had a similar circumstance. Now, as far as I know, my life was never threatened, as far as I know. But I can tell you this. I had heard through the grapevine that I was the white devil. I was coming there to steal their children, take them back to America, and sell them off as slaves. I was all kinds of horrible things. And then that was evidenced, and I shared this a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago now, how time's flying. We were out passing out tracts in the neighborhood, and I went up to a door and I knocked on it, and I was going to hand the tract to a lady, and she backed up like whatever I had in my hand was going to burn her. And I said, "It's just a gift. I don't want to touch you. I just want to hand you this gift. You read it at your leisure." She's like, no, I can't take it. No. Her priest had been telling her, "Great is Diana, great is Diana, great is Diana. And don't listen to that guy over there." Do you see the similarities? Now, like I said, as far as I know, my life was never in danger. Zacatecas, and I got to tell you on this side, Zacatecas was a beautiful city. It was a friendly city. We loved living there. It was great. It was about 8,000 feet up in altitude. It was cool, not like here. We got acclimated to it there. We could walk out on the streets at 2 o'clock in the morning, go down, hey, I feel like some tacos. We'd walk down to the taco stand and get some tacos. I mean, it was safe. It was a great city to live in. We were sorry that the Lord called us out of there. We have since then, we have learned that Zacatecas, the city that we are in, is in the top 10 murder capitals. The cartel moved in, and they are now one of the top 10 murder capitals. It's either of Mexico or it's of the world. It's one of the two. But it's turned really bad, and so I believe that's why the Lord pulled us out. We still have friends there. The Mexican folks that we led to the Lord, we still have there. But the Lord moved us, and of course here we are now in this place, which is not 8,000 feet up. It's hot. But what Paul was going through here, this wasn't the only thing going on, and I believe Demetrius had stirred up the craftsmen, and those craftsmen, and we've seen this in other passages where they would hire some lewd fellows, and they would pursue. And so if you think about this going on, and Paul seeing for 2 hours, the whole city shouting out, great is Diana of the Ephesians, great is Diana of the Ephesians, great is Diana of the Ephesians, for 2 hours straight. Do you think that grieved him? Do you think that grieved him? I mean, he was there trying to liberate them from the bonds of idolatry. And then for 2 hours straight, they were just chanting. And it almost started a riot. Did you guys see that in this? The townsman who was talking about this, doing nothing rash. And I'm trying to look for the exact wording, and I'm not seeing it. But, this day's uproar. Doesn't that sound like a riot? This day's uproar. I wonder if they went through and was burning chariots and breaking down, breaking glass in store windows and, doing different stuff. What do you think? You think they walked through the city and destroyed their own city? Well, humans are humans, aren't they? Doesn't really matter what time it is. When there's a riot, I never did like Ahmed. I'm going to go in there and destroy his little storefront, his little chariot wheel repair shop. He didn't pay his dues to us craftsmen, and so we're going to go in there and we're going to. And then blame it on Paul. But Paul, once again, let me read to you 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 8 and 9. We would not have you ignorant of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. Now, the only two that could have despaired of their life were Gaius and Aristarchus, right? They were the only two that were grabbed. And then Alexander, he came in, he tried to calm everybody down, but then they found out he was a Jew. So maybe 3 of them would have something to despair about. But they wouldn't even let Paul in. Maybe he despaired because he couldn't get out there into the action. But it says that we despaired even of life. We had the sentence of death in ourselves. Now that almost sounds like he had already died to self. We can take 2 different takes on that verse. He died to self and he didn't care. Number 1. Or number 2, there were some death threats. But this occasion in Acts chapter 19 is one of the things that's going on in Paul's life at the time, where he feels like he's under all of this pressure. Another one in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, again, if you want to turn there, and then we'll go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. I'm not going to preach through 2 Corinthians 11 because we're going to get there. But I am going to mention it. Did Paul have troubles in his travels? He kind of gives a small testimony in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 22. He gives us testimony here. By the way, my testimony was nowhere near his. Neither is, I don't think, anybody else's. Are they Hebrews? So am I. This is verse 22. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A day and a night I have been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils of the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside those things that are without. Those are things that are on the outside. That which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. So we only read in Acts chapter 19 a small portion of what was going on at the time when Paul wrote this letter to the second letter to the Corinthians. We see a small part of what's going on, but he still got the care of the churches on the inside, and he's still got all these things going on. Because in Acts, before we get to Ephesus, he's been in this city, and this city, and this city, and this city, and they ran him out. Remember the one time they stoned him? Left him for dead outside the city? He got up, shook it off, and walked into the city. Paul was a tough dude. They don't use small rock. Matter of fact, is this the time, Art, when we were talking about the stone? You guys, some of you may be wondering, why is there a rock on the platform? Did you guys ever even notice a rock on the platform? I was preaching along the lines of stoning, and I had somebody walk outside and get me one of those pebbles that is out in the little walkway right here. I said, they didn't throw stones like this because if they did, that doesn't hurt. Now, if I was to do the same thing with that would hurt a little bit, wouldn't it? So I preached that whole message, and then Art comes in the evening with this rock. He said, "Preacher, I just want you to know that I can get rocks. I can get stones. Just to help me." That's a reminder for me not to get wayward. But stones like that is what they used, or bigger. As big a stone as they could carry and they could hurl is what they threw at Paul. And it's not just like one or two, but the heap. They heaped. And old Paul shakes off the rocks, walks into the same town that just got done stoning him. I don't know about you, but I don't want to mess with Paul. When I get up into heaven, I'm going to say, "Yes, sir," to Paul. How did he get through all of these things? How did he make it through? There's a secret to it. And you know what? This church helped me through a trial that I just had a couple of weeks ago. With the same way. Go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and let's look at verse 11. We didn't read verse 11, did we? There's a secret to being able to slough off what the world throws at you, to be able to slough off being ill, to be able to slough off any trial, any tribulation. There is a secret. You know what that secret is? Verse 11. Ye also helping together by prayer for us. You know how Paul was able to continue on? He had prayer support. He had prayer support. Hey guys, if you're not going through any of these troubles, by the way, that's the generic guys and gals. If you're not going through troubles, be praying for somebody. Pray. Pray for all those around you. Pray for your family, pray for your church, pray for your pastor, pray for your pastor's wife. You know, your pastor's wife had to go through that same ordeal that your pastor had to go through? Do you know that? She sat in the hospital room with me from when she could to when she could. Each day. Ye also helping together by prayer for us, that for the gift bestowed upon us by the means of many persons, thanks may be given by many on our behalf. You know the secret? The prayers of the saints. You know what got Paul through it? Yes, it was the Lord. Absolutely, it was God. But it was the prayers of the saints to God. We've got a job to do. You know, when we know there are some people out on the front lines, like our missionaries that we support, we ought to be praying for them. They go through some things that they won't even tell us in their prayer letters. You know how I know that? There's some things we went through that we didn't tell any of our churches. We just said, pray hard. We'd write back in our prayer. If you ever just see in the prayer letter, pray hard. They're going through it. Now, I'll tell you this. I remember one time, and the only thing that got us through was prayer. You know how in the scriptures it says, when one is down, the other will lift him up, and then when the other is down, the other will lift him up. 3-chord fold is hard to break. You guys know the passage I'm talking about. Well, it's the same thing in a marriage, you know, and as missionaries. So my wife would get down, but I would be up. Then I would get down and my wife would be up, and we'd encourage each other like that. There was one time in our ministry in the 10 years we were in Mexico that both of us were down. I'm calling pastor, we're quitting. There was a time zone issue. And it was late. And so I'm not going to call pastor today, I'll call him tomorrow. Tomorrow comes, we get through the morning routine. Some things come up. I got to go pay some bills. By the way, paying bills in Mexico is an all-day event. Paying one bill in Mexico is an all-day event. You got to go there, stand in line, pay it with cash, and then leave and go home. So I got home. There's a time zone issue, so I couldn't call my pastor. I said, I'm going to call him the next day. It went like that for 2 weeks. And then finally, both of us got out of the stoop that we're in, out of the slump that we were in, and we continued on, and the Lord used us. The only thing that kept us was somebody back in the States, and we don't know who it is. Many had to have been praying for us. Making it so that I had to be busy in the morning and the afternoon, so that by the time I got home to make the phone call, it was too late for me to call my pastor. For 2 weeks. Until we finally got out of that slump. What would have happened had we quit? Well, let me ask you this. What would not be here today had we quit? Old Pueblo Baptist Church would not be here today if we'd quit. You might say, well, it's a small church. It's not really, that important. It's a light. It's a light. And it's over here. And it's a place of refuge where people can come in. There's not a lot of options out there. Not if you're looking for Bible preaching. There's a lot of options if you're just looking to go get entertained. I can recommend a whole bunch of entertaining churches to you. I can recommend a whole bunch of them that speak way better than I do. Now, I don't know what you'll hear, but they're eloquent speakers. They probably even sing while they're speaking. You don't want me to sing. Hey, that was a little too fast and a little too hearty there. But there's not a lot of choices out there, is there? I mean, some of you are looking. There's not a lot of choices. But you know what helped us? The prayers of the folks back here. We need to really get a hold of that. You know, when we send out texts, so-and-so, like we just did with Tammy's daughter, Dawn, she fell. Let's pray for her. For Randy's sister, had a stroke. Let's pray for her. For, whoever else, we got to pray. The only thing that's going to sustain us is prayer. The only thing that's going to sustain us is prayer. And Paul is emphasizing that here in verse number 11. You know how I got through it all? I got through it because you were praying. All right, questions, comments about anything we looked at this evening? Anything, questions, comments?